The purpose of this plan is to define a vision, a community-driven vision for the future of mobility throughout the neighborhood. So rather than focusing on a specific corridor, we're looking at the community as a whole, because we recognize that changes to one street may have impacts on nearby streets. The final plan will identify a list of projects, as the council member said. Those projects, though, will all directly be related to that vision and will help us achieve that vision. And once the final plan is adopted, then we can start identifying projects to implement, to fund and implement. Some of those we'll be able to do in the short term, and some will be more long-term projects. But we're going to keep you involved throughout this process, and then into the future through implementation. All right. So before we get started, I want to make sure that before we get into the details of the neighborhood transportation plan, I want to make sure that we are all aware that this is not the same as the general plan update that you maybe have heard of, maybe you'd be following along. The general plan update is a city-wide planning effort, and it's really high level. You'll have more opportunities to weigh in on that plan and elements of the general plan in late summer 2021. Today, we're talking about some of the elements of that, like the possible lane reductions included in the general plan update, and the specific designs that are possible with those lane reductions. However, neither of these plans are going to move forward alone, and we're in close coordination with the general plan update team, and we're going to make sure whatever recommendations we have in this plan are consistent with that plan and vice versa. So today's objectives. I'll give you a quick overview of the work that we've done so far to identify your priorities and concerns, and then we'll talk through the tools that we've identified to address those concerns and the potential applications of those tools. We will have breaks throughout the presentation, as we mentioned, to allow you to ask questions and share your experiences. And again, this workshop will be recorded so you can revisit the information and add comments using the online form at planpocketgreenhaven.org. That'll be open for 2 weeks. So we started this project about a year ago by collecting and assessing existing conditions data. Key data sets included traffic counts and crash data. For the traffic counts, we actually looked back to 2019 to get a pre-COVID snapshot of conditions, because we know a lot of changes happened about a year ago, right? Additionally, we took inventory of the built environment, existing crosswalks, stop signs, traffic signals, bike lanes, bus stops, and other features that exist today. We also supplemented that data with feedback from the community about how you get around and what you envision for the future. Through the existing conditions analysis, we learned that many streets are built for a much higher volume of traffic than exists today, or that existed in 2019, rather. Our crash data shows that most crashes are caused by people driving at unsafe speeds, and that our elderly neighbors are unfortunately the most common victims of those crashes. We also found that there's really long distances between marked crosswalks. We even measured up to a mile in some locations. Last summer, we held a series of listening sessions and used an interactive mapping tool to supplement our data with your experiences and to learn about your concerns and your needs. We got about 800 comments through the online mapping tool and through a series of workshops. And we learned that people value the parks and paths and great schools in the neighborhood, but we also heard concerns about poor driver behavior, such as speeding and running stop signs. We learned that a lot of community members would like to bike and walk for more than just recreation. However, they feel uncomfortable doing so now. All in all, as Councilmember Jennings mentioned, safety was the top priority that we heard in our outreach. Over the past 6 months, the project team has developed a list of tools that we can use to improve transportation safety and access to community destinations throughout the neighborhood. Each of the tools that we will discuss today directly relates to problems identified by you and your neighbors. At this phase of the project, we are taking these tools and we're vetting them to make sure that we have the right combination that'll serve your needs. As I mentioned previously, safety is our top priority, and unsafe speeds are the biggest safety concern. The heat map here on screen shows the locations, shows the locations where the community's speed-related concerns were concentrated. Here are some of the tools that we have to reduce vehicle speeds. Lane reductions, which is when a typical travel lane is removed from a roadway. Physical narrowing of the widths of the actual lanes is also a helpful tool. Roundabouts and traffic circles, speed lumps, speed feedback signs, which show drivers their actual speed relative to the posted speed limit, and increased enforcement by the police department, which is an effective tool. However, there aren't enough traffic enforcement officers to have a consistent presence. So in this plan, we won't be emphasizing traffic enforcement as a tool. So I'd like to talk a bit more about lane reductions. Lane reductions are one of our most effective tools to slow traffic and improve safety. The result of a lane reduction is that drivers are less comfortable and less able to drive at high speeds. We heard from you that you have observed racing type vehicle behavior and aggressive passing, high speeds while people are passing, especially on the roads where there's 2 lanes in each direction. A lane reduction would reduce these instances of bad driver behavior and unsafe speeds. So the diagram on the top of the screen here shows a typical cross section of a street with 2 lanes in each direction with a median. This actually depicts a portion of Pocket Road. It's difficult to say. You see that between the sidewalk and the median, there's a parking lane, a bike lane that's directly adjacent to 2 travel lanes, and then that same layout is mirrored on the other side of the median. With a lane reduction, the pavement could be restriped to add new features. The diagram on the bottom shows buffers on each side of the bike lane and maintained parking next to the curb, but this is just one of the layouts that's possible when a lane reduction is implemented for safety reasons. Additionally, with 1 travel lane in each direction, it's safer and easier for pedestrians to cross fewer lanes of traffic, and we can still maintain left turn movements where there's no median. A quick note here, before we move on, is that in some locations in the city, such as on Florin Road, lane reductions have been made on a case-by-case basis as part of maintenance projects. It is my understanding that little outreach was done prior to that lane reduction, and more outreach and education would have been helpful prior to installing parking protected bikeways there. With this plan that we're talking about today, we are looking at the entire neighborhood comprehensively, and we want to hear from you now about your preferences for future lane reductions. So to determine the appropriate number of lanes on a given roadway, we use traffic counts. Typically, a road with 1 lane in each direction can accommodate up to 20,000 vehicles per day. This diagram on screen shows the roadways in green with fewer than 20,000 vehicles per day. Some segments are as low as 7,000 vehicles per day. The analysis was based on traffic counts again from 2019. So these counts are pre-pandemic. There's probably fewer vehicles per day there now, or a year ago, definitely. The blue segment of Riverside Boulevard up in the north part of the map has fewer than, fewer than 20,000 vehicles per day, but was deemed not appropriate for a lane reduction because the volume of the turning movements along the segment. So that's another factor at play here. In addition to those factors, we also think about peak hour operations. So pre-pandemic, we would see these peaks around typical commute times. And we probably still see some peaks, but they're probably not as prominent now that there's fewer people driving. The diagram here shows the estimated peak delay that can be expected if these segments are reduced to 1 lane in each direction. These delays are compared to what travel times were in 2019. According to our analysis, the maximum travel delay along one of these corridors, any one of these colors, if they were reduced to 1 lane in each direction, is a minute or less.
You're muted, Leslie.
Sorry, I muted myself for a second there. Okay, so somebody led us quite well into this next segment. Going to move on to additional tools that improve safety by slowing vehicles, and one of those is roundabouts and traffic circles. In addition to slowing the vehicle speeds, we can use these to improve pedestrian crossings with refuge islands like in the top picture on the slide. One limitation though to roundabouts and traffic circles is they physically require a lot of space. Shown in the lower image is a mini traffic circle that's similar to what we've put in other neighborhoods throughout the city of Sacramento, and similar to what would potentially be appropriate in your neighborhood as well. So something we also know about traffic circles, and I think, there we go, is that roundabouts and traffic circles is that they work best when they're grouped together. So we've identified 2 groupings where roundabouts or traffic circles could be used to slow speeds. So those are on Rivergate Way, Pocket Road, and on Rush River Drive, where we have all those senior facilities. And we know, as I mentioned before, that seniors are our most vulnerable neighbors, and these could reduce speeds to reduce the risk for our senior neighbors. Additionally, another tool that we can use to improve safety by slowing drivers down is speed lumps. I'm sure you're all familiar with how speed lumps work, but there are, again, some limitations. We can only place speed lumps on 2-lane residential roadways with posted speeds under 30 miles per hour. We've identified a few locations that are appropriate for speed lumps around schools and where we've heard your concerns about cut-through traffic. We've heard early in our outreach that cut-through traffic is a major concern. And that's why we're looking at the neighborhood holistically rather than just at one road at a time. With any of our speed lumps that we would ever install, we do work with regional transit and the fire department to make sure that their vehicles can still be accommodated and get over those bumps. So now it's time to move on to go over tools related to improving access to destinations, especially for people walking and biking. During our community engagement, we heard that many of you would like to walk children to school or bike to the grocery store or use active transportation more frequently for other daily trips, but that right now it's not always comfortable to do so. So the biggest concern we heard is that there aren't enough safe and comfortable places for pedestrians to cross the street. The map here shows where we heard that there is a need for new crossings or crossing improvements. Tools that we do have to improve crossings, and we sort of started going over this, are high visibility crosswalk markings to make the crosswalks and the people using them stand out to drivers, curb extensions and refuge islands that shorten the distance for someone to cross from sidewalk to sidewalk. Raised crosswalks are marked with paint, but they're also raised to the height of the sidewalk. So even when no one's using the crosswalk, that's another cue for motorists to slow down. There we go. We also have rectangular rapid flashing beacons, which we call RRFBs, and so that's what's pictured on top. That's where a pedestrian pushes a button to activate flashing lights, and also pedestrian hybrid beacons, which are a little bit different because when the pedestrian activates them, there's actually a red light that stops traffic and allows pedestrians to cross. That's what you see in the bottom picture. So as I was talking about, as I was talking about with all of our tools, these can't always be applied in all situations. So the map shows locations where new or improved crossings are appropriate to meet your needs. Considerations for the type of crossing is based on speeds and number of vehicles and the number of lanes to cross, as we were talking about before. To create this map, we also considered key destinations like bus stops, schools, and shopping centers. The purple dots here show existing crosswalks that could be improved, and the green dots are locations for potential new crosswalks. As I mentioned before, right now in some locations, it's over a mile between crossings, and ideally we'll get the distance between crossings down to 1,200 feet or less. Another way that we can make travel more comfortable, easier, and safer to get around the neighborhood is to identify and fill gaps in the bikeway network. There are many types of bikeways with various levels of comfort for the user. The standard on-street bike lane that requires a person to ride directly adjacent to traffic isn't always comfortable, especially for children or less experienced riders. Buffered bike lanes include a painted buffer to add space between the person on a bike and moving vehicles. And buffers can also be added on the other side of the bike lane to avoid what we call the door zone. Protected bike lanes use vertical separation, such as a post or a parked car, to add physical separation between the person on a bike and the moving vehicles. And neighborhood bikeways and trails. I'm sure you're familiar with these. They're very well used throughout the pocket. But we did identify some gaps in that network that we noticed in our existing conditions research, and we also heard through our community outreach where those gaps are. So ideally, we'll create a complete network of bikeways that are comfortable for riders of all skill levels. So even little kids and folks who are less experienced riders can get around. This map shows potential for new and improved bikeways as dotted lines. So the dotted lines here are what either where there's an existing bikeway of a different type that we're proposing to change, or a new bikeway altogether. Some considerations that we use are the width of a street doesn't always include space for a buffered or a separated bikeway. The speed and number of vehicles greatly affects the comfort of a person on a bike. So lanes aren't always necessary on small residential streets. And also areas with a lot of driveways, that vertical separation like a post or parking protected bikeway aren't always feasible because of the movements in and out of those driveways. We also learned that there's gaps in the shared use path network. And so I've identified some of those here because these are where we saw a lot of community feedback about the need to fill those gaps. Here's one specific location where we learned there's a lot of challenges for people biking and walking, and that's crossing Greenhaven between Florin and Windbridge. As you'll see there, that sort of hot spot on the map shows that we heard a lot of concerns about this area. The Lake Crest Village Shopping Center is here on the east side of Greenhaven, and we heard that there's a lot of concern about people biking and walking directly across the street, mid-block, with no marked crossings, especially at the end of the canal path. So an idea that we had to reduce this behavior is to add a traffic signal at Greenhaven and Secret River Drive, which is at the entrance to the shopping center. This way, people who are using that canal path can bike through the neighborhood and cross at the new traffic signal, or folks walking along the path or out of the neighborhood could walk up the sidewalk and cross at that traffic signal rather than running across the street mid-block, which we heard is a real concern. There are also a number of additional ideas that we heard that we don't really fall squarely into any of the categories that we've talked about today, but will ultimately improve safety and mobility. Programs like these are funded kind of in different ways. And so some would require the support of schools or community groups or businesses or other partners, but they're still important. And these include educational campaigns about shared use path etiquette, or bike or walk to school days or walking school buses, but also adding lighting and wayfinding signage could really help be assets to the community and help people get around safely. So looking at next steps, we will take your comments, as everyone has mentioned several times, for the next 2 weeks. We'll consider all of that input and compile that and answer additional questions, review those comments, and then we'll have a draft plan, holistic plan. Probably late fall is a little more realistic than early fall. And then we want to go back out to you. And as the council member mentioned, hopefully we can do that in person, maybe not, but we'll definitely keep you informed of when that plan is available. And we'll take your comments again at that time. This is a real iterative process. So once we finalize the plan, we'll bring it to City Council in early 2022. And if adopted, as everyone has said, then we can start that process of seeking funding and hopefully implementing some of the short-term items, and then identifying a path forward for the longer-term items.